I once heard someone describe the Middle Ages as a time when childhood was just a short, inconvenient pause before labor. I am your bedtime historian, and tonight I'd like to introduce you to a world where 5-year-olds were expected to act like adults, and being seen and not heard wasn't just a saying, it was the law of the land. In this strange mirror of modern childhood, small hands were handed serious responsibilities and serious consequences. The candles are smoking, the church bells echo like distant yawns, and somewhere a young boy is being scolded for blinking too loudly. Why did adults treat children like miniature sinners, with bills to pay and chores to finish? What did it feel like to grow up under the gaze of a world that barely acknowledged childhood at all? And why did so many parents, poor and noble alike, think fear was better than affection? If you find yourself soothed by paradoxes, ancient punishments, and the strange comfort of knowing that at least you didn't grow up under feudal law, go ahead and like this video or subscribe. If you think quiet rebellion deserves a weekly dose of sleepy storytelling. Do you ever wonder what bedtime sounded like in the year 1280? I imagine it involved more creaky floorboards and fewer lullabies. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in a cramped timber house, one-room dirt floor, and the smell of stewed turnips that never quite leaves the air. A toddler sits solemnly beside the hearth, trying not to cough in the smoke. Across from him, a 7-year-old tightens a string around his boot while listening for his father's footsteps. Not because he's excited, but because he's worried. If his chores aren't done, there might be a scolding, or worse, extra work. In the medieval imagination, a child wasn't a blank slate or a whimsical dreamer. They were small sinners, born guilty in need of immediate discipline. Theologians preached that even babies carried the stain of original sin, and moral instruction couldn't start too soon. As early as age 5, children in noble households were expected to learn etiquette, and recite prayers with the seriousness of monks. In peasant families, they fetched water-weeded gardens and took livestock to pasture. There's a certain charm in imagining a 6-year-old walking a goose on a string until you realize he's doing it at sunrise in freezing rain with no shoes. Childhood as we understand it today didn't exist in the same emotional color. There were no toy boxes, no birthday cakes, no quiet chats about feelings, just tasks, obedience, and the looming authority of parents, priests, and occasionally the bailiff. Some scholars argue that this lack of childhood was cultural, not a sign of cruelty, but necessity. With high mortality rates and scarce resources, families had little room for sentimentality. Others remain unsettled by how many historical texts refer to children primarily as useful or troublesome. There's no scholarly consensus, but the silence of the children in the records may speak volumes. And so, in a world where silence was safety and compliance was a kind of survival, children grew up fast, or not at all. The morning frost clings to the monastery's stone walls like an old complaint, and the echo of wooden sandals on flagstone gives the schoolroom a rhythm of quiet dread. Inside, rows of boys shift uncomfortably on hard benches, their quills scratching like restless mice. The air smells of ink-old wool and boiled leeks from the monk's lunch next door. You slide into a seat near the back, just as Brother Aldrich enters, clutching a birch rod the way a maestro holds his baton. School for many medieval children, especially boys lucky enough to attend, was less about learning letters and more about surviving discipline. Whether in monastic settings or cathedral schools, education came with a side of strictness, often delivered by cane. Children were expected to memorize Latin prayers, chant the Psalms, and sit still for hours, even if they were barely tall enough to see over the desk. Misbehavior had a clear hierarchy. Whispering a slap on the knuckles, doodling in your primer, a rap on the head, forgetting your declensions, bend over and present your backside, birch rods didn't swing themselves. The punishment wasn't just to correct you, but to correct the room. A single cry might settle 15 others. Yet, not every punishment left bruises. There was the dreaded dunce cap pointed itchy and humiliating. You'd wear it while facing the corner, the Latin word stultus fool inked boldly down its side. Some versions had donkey ears, others jingled. The goal wasn't just discipline, it was spectacle. A warning to others: do not follow this path, lest your head become ornamental. Some historians now argue that the birch rod was more symbolic than severe, a sort of ritual meant to reinforce authority rather than inflict pain. Surviving school texts include marginal doodles of mischievous monks tied to their own desks, a bit of rebellion preserved in ink. There's still scholarly debate over whether corporal punishment was truly constant or more of a theatrical threat. After all, not every monk had the stamina to whip every boy daily. Still, the tools of discipline were always visible: birch branches soaked in water to stay supple, a sand hourglass for timed silence, a single candle stub used to mark out hours of copying without error. Discipline in these schools was physical, yes, but it was also mental. A child might leave knowing how to parse scripture, but remain haunted by the creak of the master's stool. And it wasn't only boys. Some convent schools taught girls, usually noble daughters, where silence, neat stitching, and prayer were graded more harshly than spelling. A crooked hem could earn you a scolding. A sarcastic remark might cost you supper. There was no recess-only embroidery. In this world, discipline didn't pause when the bell rang. It followed you home. And as you glance at the quiet boy beside you, lips moving silently through a prayer he dare not forget, you realize this classroom was not just about education. It was about training obedience one verse at a time. The day stretches long in the village yard, where hens peck at crumbs and laundry flaps like defeated banners in the wind. You stand by the well, a wooden bucket in hand, not for play, but because you didn't scrub the hearth properly this morning. Your mother's voice still rings in your ears: no bread until the kindling's stacked. But that wasn't the worst of it. When chores weren't punishment enough, there was always the church. For many medieval children, especially those in farming or artisan households, correction began at home with tools already in hand. Disobedient more chores, back talk, double water fetching duty, clumsy with eggs. You might clean the outhouse pails. Domestic punishment was rarely violent, but it was persistent and often public. Neighbors watched and older siblings jeered. The goal wasn't only obedience, it was shame. Yet when household correction failed or a child crossed some moral boundary, the next step was more spiritual. A visit to the parish priest. It wasn't exactly confession. It was more like moral intervention. The priest might assign penance, offer a stern sermon, or in more dramatic cases, stand the child before the altar and make them recite sins aloud. Candles flickered, saints stared down, and the silence felt heavier than any punishment stick. This form of correction had layers. On the surface, it was about spiritual health, but deeper down, it reinforced parental authority through divine proxy. After all, if God heard your lies about stealing the neighbor's apples, surely he'd send a storm to ruin your family's barley. That fear was real and cultivated. Historians remain divided on how effective this moral correction truly was. Some argue it merely terrified children into silence. Others suggest it had a lasting psychological hold. Records show that children as young as 7 were told they bore the weight of sin, that every misstep might summon demons or worse, social ridicule. You can still imagine it, can't you? A candlelit chapel, the smell of wax and cold stone, a boy in patched wool standing under a stained glass window, of St. Michael slaying the devil, only he feels like the devil now. All because he forgot to sweep the chicken feathers before Sunday Mass. And of course, some parents embellish the consequences. If you lie again, We'll send you to the monastery they had worn. The monks will put you in the cellar with the skulls. Or St. Cuthbert sees everything, and he doesn't forget. Fear was the fulcrum. Correction wasn't about justice. It was about influence. Occasionally, the church offered gentler remedies, assigning the child a help with candle polishing, bell ringing, or sweeping the nave. These tasks felt solemn, almost sacred, but they were also isolating. A silent job in a silent building, time enough for a child to stew in guilt or craft fantastical fears. In the hush of that holy space, one question always lingered. Was the sin truly forgiven or merely postponed? And so, as dusk falls and the chores are finally done, you begin to understand in medieval homes, obedience was sculpted with labor and holiness, sometimes with humiliation. There's a different kind of silence at the village pond, not peaceful but thick with tension. A teenager barely past her 14th summer sits on the edge of a wooden contraption with water lapping below. The villagers gather in a semicircle, not with anger, but with the same bored fascination reserved for goose plucking or mending socks. She's being strapped into the cucking stool, her wrists trembling just slightly as the straps are tightened. In the Middle Ages, certain punishments weren't about pain at all. They were about shame. And when it came to teenage girls accused of gossiping nagging, or what they called disorderly tongues, humiliation was the weapon of choice. The cucking stool, a type of ducking chair, wasn't always used in water. Sometimes it was displayed in the square empty as a warning. But when employed, it made a scene. You might think only adults were subjected to such devices. But in many cases, teenage girls were fair game, especially if they were outspoken, flirtatious, or simply unlucky enough to be blamed for rumors. Idle boys, too, faced their share of public scolding, often forced to wear signs or strange costumes that mocked their laziness. But the girls, well, they got the chair. Some were lowered gently into water, others not so much. It depended on the mood of the constable or how much the town baker resented you. One chronicle case tells of a miller's daughter dunked 3 times for spreading tales about her aunt's alleged romance with a monk. Whether the story was true didn't matter. The punishment was meant to wash away the behavior and make others think twice. There is no scholarly consensus on how widespread these punishments were. Some claim they were rare and theatrical, more fable than fact. Others cite town records and fines that mention names of fences and repairs to the wooden stool, suggesting regular use. What's clearer is that these punishments walked a line between justice and community theater. And, oh, the theater of it. Children watched. Parents nodded solemnly. The village fool might add a bawdy rhyme. For a girl being dunked, the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the laughter, the nicknames that stuck long after her clothes dried. Duckling Daisy or Chatterbucket Beth. Identity became punishment. Sometimes older women protested. "She's no worse than I was," one widow muttered in a 14th century record from Yorkshire. But the officials rarely listened. Obedience wasn't just a virtue, it was public property. And the stool ensured everyone saw who had crossed the invisible line. Even today, the remains of some cucking stools survive in museums' fragile wood, with iron hinges worn by time and water. They seem quaint at first glance, but if you stare long enough, you might hear the splash, the gasp, and the quiet shame that followed. It's not the noise that stays with you, it's the silence after. So, as you picture the stool drying in the sun and the villagers returning to their bread and sheep, remember in the medieval world gossip wasn't just frowned upon, it got you a front row seat to your own humiliation. A boy sits cross-legged on the packed earth, a rod resting beside him like an accusation. He hasn't been struck yet, but the presence of the slender switch is enough. His eyes don't water from pain, but from the pressure of being watched. In this dim cottage, the rod doesn't lash at looms. The phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" has echoes older than you might think. In medieval rural homes, rods were a standard fixture, sometimes willow, sometimes birch, sometimes the nearest stick that looked flexible enough to make a point without leaving a mark. But here's the twist. Many of those rods were never used. They just sat in the corner, visible, present. A kind of passive threat. In some households, a child might be told, "Fetch me the rod," only to have it placed on the table as a warning. Scholars debate whether this method leaned more toward discipline or deterrence. Was the rod a symbolic tool of moral formation, or merely a shortcut to control? The answer, as usual, lies somewhere in the fog of anecdote and archive. Interestingly, some rods were decorative, adorned with ribbons hung above mantels or braided by grandmothers who insisted they had never needed to use it. The object itself became ritualistic, a totem of authority. One French account describes a child being required to kiss the rod in apology, a kind of penance mixed with pageantry. You weren't beaten, you bowed. Still, not every household used the rod gently. In harsher homes, especially those struggling under crop failures or mounting debts, tempers snapped faster than twigs. A lost egg, a spilled pot, a lie about stealing honey, any of these might earn a stinging lesson. Yet again, surviving accounts vary. Some parents claimed they had no choice. Others insisted they only raised their hand in love, which is a phrase that hasn't aged well. Some clerics even encouraged moderation. "Better to teach than to strike," wrote one abbot in a sermon still copied centuries later. But other voices disagreed. "The rod drives out folly" claimed a popular proverb, suggesting that children's minds were sponges for sin unless squeezed regularly. There is no scholarly consensus on how widely these views translated into action, only fragmented mentions in court records letters and the margins of household ledgers. Children, meanwhile, adapted. One folk tale tells of a boy who hid his father's rod in the thatch roof every morning, hoping it would be forgotten by nightfall. Another swore he could fake tears on command just enough to earn sympathy from his grandmother and avoid an evening lesson. For some families, the rod became a measure of discipline without ever drawing blood. For others, it crossed into cruelty masked by tradition. The line between warning and wielding blurred easily, especially when a child's voice wasn't part of the historical record. And so, as you glance again at the rod on the floor, unmoving but heavy in meaning, you understand in this medieval world, silence could be taught with soundless threats. And sometimes the punishment that never came was the one you remembered longest. The market square is unusually still, except for the occasional flutter of a pigeon and the soft creak of wooden signs swinging in the breeze. Near the stone cross at the center, a boy kneels on cobblestones, holding a slate above his head. Chalked on it in unsteady script, "I stole 3 apples." His arms ache, his cheeks burn, and behind him, townspeople glance over, murmur, then move on to inspect carrots or haggle over fish. Public shaming was one of the medieval world's favorite tools, cheap, visible, and oddly versatile. For children, the punishments didn't always involve stocks or lashes. Sometimes it was a sign, or kneeling on peas, or standing barefoot in winter with your misdeed scrawled across your chest. The goal wasn't to hurt, but to humiliate, to inscribe the lesson, not on the body, but on the memory. Children were frequently subjected to these lesser punishments, especially in smaller towns where everyone knew everyone. The offenses were petty pilfered, fruit-skip chores, fibbing to the baker. The response, equal parts theater and discipline. Kneeling by the market cross was one of the most common rituals a child made to recite prayers, hold a weight, or simply endure the gazes of those passing by. Some towns even had dedicated shame stones or marked spots near fountains where children were sent to kneel, often supervised by a constable's bored apprentice. One English parish record notes a boy sentenced to wear a hat shaped like a pig's snout after he tried to swindle a neighbor out of cheese. Another girl aged 9 had to sing a psalm in public every morning for a week after lying about her chores. The idea was correction through exposure and a bit of mild embarrassment. Was it effective? That's where historians disagree. Some say the shame wore off quickly like bruises on pride. Others argue it created deeper behavioral change, if only because the child dreaded the memory. But what's clear is that the community played a key role. Public shaming wasn't just between child and parent, it was a civic affair, one that reinforced shared norms. Parents often collaborated in these rituals, even if reluctantly. Better the square than the rod, some would mutter. Others saw it as more merciful a punishment that left no physical mark yet instilled the kind of social self-awareness considered essential to growing up. And let's not forget, adults weren't immune either. Drunkards, debtors, and quarrelsome wives might kneel beside their children, both red-faced under the same stone arch. The market cross itself symbolized both commerce and morality, a place where deals were made and debts, including moral ones, repaid. To be punished, there was to become briefly part of the town's moral economy. And when the shame was over, you simply stood up, brushed the dust from your knees, and went home. So, the next time you pass a pigeon-stained statue in a cobbled square, imagine a child beside it, sign overhead, watching people barter turnips while trying not to cry. Sometimes the weight of a single word thief was heavier than any rod. The wooden frame is smaller than you expected, child-sized with iron hinges rusted by time and rain. It sits awkwardly near the blacksmith's shed, leaning against a barrel of ash like a forgotten toy with a grim purpose. A passing girl points and giggles. "That's where Tom got stuck last week," she says. "He cried so hard the baker gave him a bun. This is the naughty boy pillory." Yes, they made pillories for children. Not every town had one, but in those that did it became a kind of local curiosity, half punishment, half public lesson, and occasionally an unintended comedy. Unlike the towering adult versions used for criminals and blasphemers, the child pillory was often closer to waist height, its holes just the right size for a stubborn neck and two skinny wrists. You kneel beside it, examining the carving's a crude heart, the initials RB, and a scratch drawing of what appears to be a chicken on stilts. The wood is worn smooth, not just from use, but from little hands fidgeting nervously while stuck in place. Offenses varied: petty theft, name-calling, skipping lessons. The punishments weren't long an hour, maybe 2, but time stretches differently when your nose itches and you can't scratch it. Records tell of one carpenter's son, age 10, locked into the pillory for lying about a broken spindle. He panicked halfway through and couldn't get his head back out. The constable had to grease the frame with tallow and mutter apologies while the boy's mother yelled that he'd been humiliated enough. The village priest suggested moving the device to the rectory, where more dignity might be preserved. That did not happen. Some children were jeered at. Others received apples or pats on the head. It all depended on the village mood. In one town, it became a sort of rite of passage. You haven't truly grown up until you've wept in the frame they joked. But for the children inside, the experience was often confusing. Were they criminals, examples, or simply unlucky? Historians remain divided. Some argue these pillories were rarely used and exaggerated in memory, like childhood nightmares of monsters under the bed. Others find enough mentions in court rolls and parish fines to suggest they were real and used enough to leave a mark not on the body, but on the story a village told about discipline. Occasionally the pillory was painted, bright red with painted eyes and teeth, to resemble a beast eating the naughty child. This, of course, delighted spectators and terrified the younger siblings watching nearby. A few children later described the experience in adulthood as unbearable, except for the part where "my sister sneaked me a plum." And so, the naughty boy pillory straddled a strange space discipline theater folklore. It didn't always correct behavior, but it always made an impression. You leave the square quietly, imagining the ache in the shoulders, the tickle of a fly on the nose, and the slow drip of melted tallow down a child's collar. In the medieval world, even your punishment might be miniature, but never minor. The stage is crooked, the costumes itchy, and the audience mostly uninterested, except when someone forgets a line or trips over a wooden halo. You're backstage peering through a moth-eaten curtain as another child delivers their lines. Pride goeth before the fall, he shouts just before slipping on a turnip peel and falling flat. The priest nods, the children giggle. You're up next, playing greed. Your prop is an oversized coin glued to a hat. In some parishes, misbehaving children were sentenced to participate in moral plays, small theatrical productions performed in chapels, town squares, or even local taverns. The idea was clear turn public embarrassment into a tool for moral instruction. Instead of the rod, the script. Instead of shouts, rhymes. And for some children, it was the worst punishment of all. You didn't need talent, just a face expressive enough to look convincingly guilty. Roles rotated, envy, sloth, lying, tongue, disobedience. Each sin had a line, a gesture, and sometimes a ridiculous hat. The scripts were repetitive, full of warnings about hellfire or dishonor, but softened with slapstick. A child playing Wrath might be pelted with bread rolls. Lust was avoided altogether, too awkward, but greed got a lot of laughs, especially if they had to chase a fake chicken. Not every village had the means or interest to stage such dramas, but church-run schools and larger parishes often kept a trunk of costumes and props on hand, robes, cardboard halos, masks shaped like devils. It wasn't Broadway. It was more like medieval detention with a moral twist. Some scholars view these performances as early behavioral therapy, allowing children to role-play vices and virtues, perhaps even learn empathy. Others see it as performative humiliation, designed less to teach and more to shame. The line between moral theater and moral theater was thin, and children weren't always in on the joke. There's one recorded instance from Devonshire of a boy who played gluttony so enthusiastically stuffing turnip peels into his mouth that he was later banned from performing for making vice too charming. Another tale speaks of a shy girl who sobbed through her role as disobedience and had to be carried off stage clutching a wooden staff labeled shame. The plays were usually brief 10 to 15 minutes, but long enough to cement the memory. Afterward, the children were expected to return to their daily tasks as if nothing had happened, but the nicknames lingered. One boy became known as Master Covetous for years. Another was called Lazybones Lucian, well into adulthood. Occasionally, a child grew to enjoy the stage. A future friar once credited his role as repentance, with sparking a love of storytelling. But more often, these plays were endured, not enjoyed. A lesson in humility delivered with rhymes and bells on. So, as the final line echoes, "Repent ye little scoundrels," and the curtain is drawn, you can almost hear the sighs of relief. The punishment is over. The shame, perhaps, less so. In medieval minds, embarrassment was a shortcut to virtue. And in the world of moral plays, the script may change, but the lesson always ends the same. The sun is already low when you reach the edge of the village green, where a tall wooden post stands beside the smithy. It leans slightly, weathered by seasons and stories, with old iron rings bolted into its side. You pause, noticing the faint grooves where rope once wore into the grain. The sign nailed above it reads, "Parish Whipping Post," a drunkard's resting place. Perhaps, but not exclusively. Sometimes this was where mischievous children came to reflect painfully on their choices. In many medieval parishes, whipping posts were public fixtures. They offered a standardized location for minor corporal punishment, visible, accessible, and symbolic. While adults were the primary targets, vagrants, petty thieves, rowdy farmers, children were not exempt. especially in smaller towns where the distinction between civil law and church law blurred like ink in a puddle. The punishments administered here were brief, often ceremonial. A few lashes with a switch, a lecture delivered by the constable, and a warning, "Don't let me see you here again." Most children were brought for repeat disobedience, stealing sweets, skipping mass, or refusing to assist with chores. The public nature of the punishment was often more feared than the sting itself. One documented case in Kent describes a baker's apprentice, age 11, tied loosely and whipped once for spitting in a customer's cup. Another boy in Suffolk was made to stand with his back to the post for 2 hours after being caught lying about stolen eggs. No physical blows, just the waiting, the whispers, and the stares. Some posts even had carved markings to measure the height of the punished, like a grim ruler of shame. Others had iron neck clamps that were mercifully rarely used on children. Still, the association stuck. A child warned with, "You'll find yourself at the post," understood immediately it meant more than pain. It meant being seen. There's scholarly debate about the frequency of child punishments at these posts. Some historians believe they were rare, reserved for serious offenses. Others point to church records and local bylaws suggesting otherwise. What's undeniable is that the presence of the post served as a visual deterrent. You couldn't pass it without remembering who'd stood there last and why. Occasionally, parish priests intervened. "A child's soul bends easier than a man's," wrote one rector urging restraint. Yet not all were so gentle. One surviving sermon cheerfully describes the devil being whipped out of the boy's backside, praise be. Whether literal or metaphorical, the sentiment was clear, correction was a community duty. And of course, there was theater to it. Punishments were timed to coincide with market days or feast eves when the most eyes were present. A child might be made to read a psalm aloud before being tied, or repeat their offense in verse. Sometimes they were given a token afterward, a blessed loaf, a ribbon to signify a fresh start, a strange pairing shame and redemption hand in hand. As the shadows lengthen, you run your hand along the grooves in the post. It's quiet now, but centuries ago, this was the loudest corner of the village, and not all the cries came from grown men. The helmet rests on a wooden peg in the corner of the rectory, small iron and unmistakably odd. Shaped like a bird cage, it has a long curved plate designed to press gently but persistently against the wearer's tongue. You wouldn't expect such a strange contraption to be meant for children, but in a few scattered corners of medieval Europe it was. They called it a scold's bridle, and yes, boys wore it too. Originally designed for adult women accused of gossip nagging or public arguing, the scold's bridle, also known as the brank, found its way into the broader toolkit of public correction. In rare but unsettling cases, it was used on older boys, those considered unruly, disrespectful, or too mouthy for traditional methods. The logic was as medieval as it was metaphorical. If the mouth caused the trouble, muzzle the mouth. You approach one such helmet still preserved in a parish collection. It's smaller than expected, likely tailored for an adolescent. The iron is pitted, but the tongue plate remains intact. There's even a faint floral engraving on the brow, a cruel attempt perhaps to civilize the device with decoration. Records from northern England and the Low Countries mention its use on young chatterers or ill-mannered lads. It was a punishment steeped in silence. No beatings, no shouting, just a cold press of metal and the inability to speak. Was it common? Most scholars say no. The bridle was rare even among adult punishments, but its symbolic power was enormous, and the fact that it was ever used on children has left researchers divided. Some insist it was exaggerated in later retellings, folklore inflated through horror. Others point to ecclesiastical court notes that include lines like, "child bridle for blaspheming in jest." The ambiguity leaves a chill. One boy's tale, half preserved in a village chronicle, tells of a blacksmith's apprentice punished with a wooden version, less painful, but equally humiliating. He had mocked the church bells during matins. His punishment? A carved mask with a long red tongue, nailed in place, worn during service. It jingled when he turned his head. People laughed. He cried. In some cases, the bridle wasn't even fastened, just shown, held up at dinner, placed beside a child's plate, or set atop a stool during lessons. A wordless reminder, silence or else. And as absurd as it seems, there were some who claimed it worked. He learned to listen, wrote one parish mother, and I learned not to speak for him. It's hard to say who was punished more. Today, these devices sit in museum cases, often misidentified or sanitized. Visitors pause, puzzled, trying to imagine their use. Few guess they were ever intended for the young. Fewer still guess they were part of a system that equated silence with virtue. So, you turn from the bridle, the cold echo of metal still humming in your thoughts. In this medieval landscape, the tongue wasn't just for speech, it was a liability. And for some children, silence was forged not through wisdom, but wire. The cottage is unusually quiet tonight. No crackling fire, no muttering over spilled milk, no footsteps creaking across the floorboards. You sit by the hearth, wondering what line was crossed this time. Your uncle argues that children need to be toughened. Your aunt says even calves aren't whipped without cause. The family can't seem to agree, and that disagreement you're starting to realize isn't just personal, it's cultural, it's ecclesiastical, it's medieval. Welcome to the muddled, murky middle ground of child punishment in the Middle Ages. There were no official rule books, no standardized limits. One town's gentle scolding was another's grievous sin. And as for how much was too much, that depended on who was watching and who was swinging the stick. Clerics preached compassion in theory. Let not your hand be swifter than your heart, said one popular sermon. Bishops issued guidelines urging moderation, emphasizing spiritual correction over physical force. But on the other side of the pulpit stood parents often overwhelmed, often exhausted, sometimes just repeating what had been done to them. They believed discipline built character, or at least prevented chaos. Some historians argue that medieval discipline was more measured than we imagine. Whipping, they say, was rare and often exaggerated in stories passed down through centuries of moral anxiety. Others suggest that pain was used liberally and creatively, not just as punishment, but as preemptive instruction. A child might be switched not for doing wrong, but for thinking about it, or more accurately, for looking like they might. There are conflicting records. A Flemish court case from the 13th century mentions a mother fined for beating her son with the iron hearth tongs, a rare instance where severity was legally challenged. But in most places, what happened inside a cottage stayed there. There was no watchdog, no neighborly hotline. If a child limped or cried, it was dismissed with a shrug and a proverb. He'll learn faster now. And learn they did often how to hide, how to lie, how to keep their heads low and voices lower. A boy might memorize his prayers not out of piety, but because he feared the belt. A girl might perfect her stitching because the needle was kinder than her governess. Discipline became a kind of silent architecture, shaping behavior without conversation. The church tried to regulate it. Penitential manuals outlined acceptable punishments, often listing sins by severity and pairing them with corrective actions. But enforcement was patchy. One monk might preach mercy. Another might hand out switches with the morning porridge. Even within monasteries, attitudes varied. In some, child oblates were treated like miniature saints. In others, like kitchen scullions who needed constant correction. The absence of consensus is striking. There was no universal code, no clear line, just a muddle of sermons, sayings, and sighs. And for the children caught in between the rules were never entirely known, only felt. So as you pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and glance at the ceiling's flickering shadows, you begin to understand in this era, punishment was both omnipresent and uncertain. And often the worst part wasn't the blow itself, but never knowing when it might come. A single cherry pit lies on the wooden bench of the ecclesiastical court, a quiet reminder of the crime that brought young Thomas here. He's barely 12 barefoot and shifting nervously under the eyes of 3 priests. His offense, stealing fruit from the rectory garden, the punishment yet to be determined. But this isn't a secular trial. This is the church's domain, a place where morality rather than law renders the verdict. Ecclesiastical courts in the Middle Ages handled more than heresy and marriage disputes. They also dealt with cases involving children, especially when the offenses were tied to sin rather than property. Lying, stealing, cursing, skipping Mass all fell under spiritual jurisdiction. And when a child stepped out of line, they might find themselves in front of a stern-faced cleric with a ledger and a lot of questions. You'd think these courts were harsh. After all, sin is a serious matter. But surprisingly, they often lean toward leniency with children. Confession, repentance, and small penances like copying scripture, sweeping church steps, or attending Mass daily for a week were more common than floggings or fines. That said, there were no guarantees. A particularly grumpy archdeacon might assign harsher punishment, or worse, send the child to a monastery for spiritual correction. The cherry theft case. It really happened, recorded in a dusty parish volume from the 1314. The boy Thomas was caught red-handed by the sacristan, who claimed the lad had stolen 5 ripe fruits and left not a single coin. When brought before the church court, Thomas wept, confessed, and was sentenced to 3 days' silence, no bread at supper, and the public recitation of the Lord's Prayer in Latin twice. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't nothing. What makes these courts fascinating is the strange blend of theater theology and local politics. Sometimes families use them to settle scores. Your boy struck mine, a neighbor might claim only for the priests to lecture both children on the virtue of meekness. In one bizarre case, a girl was accused of dancing during Lent. The verdict, she had to sing a hymn in front of the bishop while standing still. There's ongoing debate among historians about how seriously these child cases were taken. Some argue they were symbolic, ritualized scoldings to reinforce communal values. Others believe they served as early moral trials, teaching children the weight of sin in a world where even fruit theft had eternal consequences. What's clear is that these courts help shape the moral landscape of medieval childhood, one tiny trial at a time. And while the punishments may seem quaint, the fear was real. Standing before the clergy surrounded by incense candlelight and stern Latin, even a confident child might tremble. The church had no soldiers, but it had authority. And in a small village that was power enough. So, as Thomas stares at the pit on the bench, cheeks flushed with shame, he's not just thinking about cherries. He's thinking about God's sin and whether stealing a fruit was worth all this fuss. The orphanage sits on a windswept hill, its stone walls gray with age and stern intent. No gardens, no laughter, just rows of boots drying by the hearth, and silence echoing through corridors. You slip inside past a matron dozing with knitting in hand and find a cluster of children scrubbing floors with rough rags. They don't look up. Not because they're shy, but because they've learned better. In medieval Europe, orphanages were more than shelters. They were systems of order. Often run by monasteries, convents, or municipal authorities, these institutions were charged with transforming wayward children into obedient subjects of church and state. The methods: food chores, prayer and punishment, daily structured, and always just close enough to kindness to be tolerated. Orphan children weren't always literal orphans. Some had parents who couldn't afford to raise them. Others were abandoned during famines or plagues. Either way, they entered a world of strict routine. Mornings began with Mass, followed by cleaning, mending, or tending to livestock. Meals were plain, beds were straw, affection was rare. Discipline came quickly sometimes for reasons as small as dropping a spoon or sighing during prayer. The tools were familiar rods, switches, kneeling boards, and silent meals. But unlike in family homes, there was no parental warmth to soften the blow. Just rules, rituals, and rotating authority figures. A mistake meant not just punishment, but losing privileges, no meat, no Sunday outings, no letters to siblings. One account from a Florentine orphanage describes a boy locked in a cold cellar for misplacing a cloak. Another was made to wear a donkey mask for idleness during matins. These weren't flukes, they were a part of a broader philosophy order, must be enforced to make the child fit for service. Whether that service was clerical, domestic, or agricultural didn't matter. Historians continue to debate the morality of these institutions. Some view them as progressive, a social safety net before modern welfare. Others see them as factories for obedience more concerned with productivity than care. The records themselves are sparse and biased, often written by the administrators, not the children. There were, however, moments of gentleness. Older girls sometimes acted as sister mothers, comforting younger ones during punishment or sneaking scraps of bread. Some monks taught games or secretly carved toys. One famous friar even wrote lullabies for the orphans in his care, soothing songs about saints and stars. But these soft edges were exceptions, not norms. The real weight of discipline in orphanages wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The children learned to police themselves, to whisper warnings, to memorize prayers not for faith, but to avoid being singled out. Order was survival. Punishment wasn't a surprise, it was expected. So, as you watch a child rinse a bucket with mechanical precision, his hands red from lye soap and cold water, you realize something haunting in a world where no one came to rescue you. Being good wasn't just moral, it was self-defense. In these stone halls, obedience wasn't asked for, it was extracted, daily, quietly, and without anyone asking what the child might become once they finally left the hill. The sky is soft with mist as you arrive in a tiny hamlet nestled between sheep fields and silence. There's no whipping post here, no pillory, just a crooked fence, a thatched chapel, and the faint sound of singing a peculiar tuneless chant rising from the village square. You step closer and find half a dozen children parading around a sack of flour dressed like a mayor while villagers chuckle from their porches. This is punishment, believe it or not, and it's surprisingly gentle. In certain medieval communities, especially smaller or more isolated ones, harsh punishments for children gave way to what could only be described as symbolic shame. Rather than rods and ducking stools, these villages turned to songs, mock ceremonies, and satirical pageants designed to embarrass, not bruise. Think of it as community theater meets parenting with a dash of medieval mischief. One of the most common customs was the silly song, a chant composed on the spot to mock a child's minor offense. Did you steal a turnip? You'd be serenaded with a rhyme about turnip thieves. Break the wash bucket, prepare for a ballad about clumsy hands. The child had to stand still while the village children sang, and everyone tried not to laugh too loudly. Another favorite was the procession of folly. The guilty child would be paraded around the village square with a crown made of straw or a stick labeled "stick of forgetting," depending on the offense. A village elder might act as town crier, announcing in an exaggerated voice, "Young Alice has again milked the cow into the wrong bucket. Oh, woe! May she learn from this sacred goat horn of wisdom," at which point a wooden horn would be tapped on her head and everyone would cheer. There was no physical pain, just mild humiliation, and a strong sense of not wanting to repeat the experience. Some scholars view these customs as precursors to modern satire and community rituals. Others argue they were simply the only option in villages with no access to formal justice or official authority. But all agree they were oddly effective. Children remembered the songs. They whispered about the straw crown long after it had been retired, and parents found the system easier to enforce. If you misbehave, they'd say the baker will write a verse about you. That was usually enough. Of course, not all children took it lightly. Some wept, some ran. A few rebelled by trying to out-satire the satire, composing their own songs in return. But for the most part, these customs remained playful, rooted in the belief that shame could instruct without harm, and that laughter could discipline just as well as a switch. And in a world so often defined by fear, there's something strikingly human about a village choosing to sing its corrections rather than shout them. Here punishment was not a scar, it was a melody carried on the breeze. So, as the last chorus fades and the flour sack mayor is bowed off stage, you realize in some corners of the Middle Ages, a giggle and a rhyme were enough to keep children in line, or at least entertained. The candle burns low in the scholar's chamber, its wax pooling beside a stack of vellum scrolls and half-eaten figs. You settle into the worn chair by the hearth, listening as the quill scratches one last line into a treatise titled On the Discipline of Youth. The author pauses, sighs, and adds a final footnote. Whether these methods enlighten or merely amuse, God knows. And just like that, you've arrived at the final chapter. Did it work? Or was it all theater? The question lingers like incense in a chapel. Across medieval Europe, from whipping posts to moral plays, punishment for children spanned a dizzying range. Harsh, symbolic, theatrical, sometimes absurd. But was it effective? Did public shame rods or silly songs actually produce better behavior? Or were they rituals designed less for children and more for the adults performing them? Some scholars argue these punishments worked precisely because they were dramatic. A pillory or scold's bridle left a memory stronger than any sermon. A shame song in the village square became folklore retold by firelight for years. Children ever attuned to status and mockery adjusted quickly. If nothing else, they learned what not to do in public. Others contend the impact was fleeting. Children are resilient, yes, but also forgetful. Humiliation one day didn't guarantee morality the next. Especially in households where fear outpaced affection, and where punishment wasn't consistent but arbitrary, driven by mood weather or whatever the goat knocked over that morning. In those cases, behavior might change, but only under watchful eyes. There's also the question of intention. Were these punishments meant to reform or to entertain? The line between justice and pageantry often blurred. A dunking in the cucking stool was a moral lesson, but also a public spectacle complete with laughter and gossip. A moral play warned against greed, but gave the village a free show on market day. Even parish punishments often aligned with holidays, drawing crowds who applauded as children knelt before the cross or sang repentance rhymes. Some researchers suggest these practices weren't really about the child at all. They were about reinforcing adult authority, maintaining community norms, and dramatizing the values people wish they live by. In this view, the punishments were less about reforming young minds and more about reminding adults what happens when control is lost. And yet, among the scrolls and scribbled sermons, we do find traces of genuine care. Records of monks who quietly reduced punishments, mothers who argued with bailiffs, teachers who gave out extra bread after a whipping. These small gestures hint at a deeper truth. Not everyone believed fear was the best teacher. So, as the candle gutters and the ink dries on that last skeptical footnote, you find yourself wondering, was medieval discipline about correction or performance? Were these rituals brutal necessity or bedtime theater played out in daylight? There is no final answer. Just echoes of laughter, silenced tears, and the creak of ancient wood under small, tired feet. Outside that chamber, the night grows colder. But across the courtyard, another story waits quieter, sadder, swaddled in linen and mystery. One child punished another simply left behind. You slip through the fog just before dawn, up a gravel path that leads to an abbey gate flanked by cold stone angels. There, tucked beside the door, lies a bundle still small, quiet. You can't hear its breath, but you know it's there. Wrapped in linen too fine for a peasant, but too worn for a noble, it gives off the faint scent of lavender and soot. This was no accident. Medieval Europe had a system quiet, unofficial, but understood. Mothers who could no longer care for their children often brought them here. Some came alone, veiled and shaking. Others sent midwives or neighbors. A select few used the foundling wheel, a kind of wooden cylinder embedded in the abbey wall, allowing one to place a baby inside, spin it out of sight, and vanish into the mist. It was common to leave something behind, a token of identification, a plea, a clue for the future. A scrap of embroidered cloth, half a coin, or a wooden button carved with initials. Not all were readable, not all were remembered, but they mattered. Church records in France from the 14th century list entries like "boy left with green ribbon" or "girl marked by mole on left cheek." One child in Milan was left with a note reading simply for the saints to sort. Scholars still debate whether these tokens were meant to claim the child later or simply to make them human in the eyes of those who found them. Some argue they were meant as emotional tethers, guilt made tangible. Others say they were practical, a means of naming when names were absent. One quirky detail survives from a 15th century abbey near York, a child left with a dead robin's feather. No note, no name. Just the feather bound with red string. Was it a symbol? A keepsake? No one knows, but the nuns kept it in a vellum pouch for 60 years. Standing at the gate, you begin to feel the cold seep into your sleeves. The morning bells toll, and a sleepy monk unlatches the door. He sees the bundle size and gently lifts it. He does not ask where it came from. You realize then the abbey gate was both an ending and a beginning. And this child, anonymous and wrapped in mystery, was now part of a larger story, one shaped by charity record-keeping and quiet survival. A soft drizzle begins to fall as the monk carries the swaddled infant across the stone courtyard. You follow his footsteps through the cloisters, where ivy creeps along the arches and rain ticks gently against stained glass. Inside the abbey is half asleep, fires low candles, flickering the smell of damp wool and old wood hanging in the air. But word travels quickly here. A baby has arrived. In medieval villages, the rescue or neglect of abandoned children depended not on laws, but on the whims and resources of the parish. Some parishes had almoners and stewards ready to organize foster care, assign a wet nurse, or arrange placement in a poorhouse. Others shrugged. If the monks were overstretched, if funds ran dry, or if famine stalked the fields, there might be no help at all. Still, some communities were kind. You imagine a round-faced butcher's wife taking in a child she didn't birth but couldn't ignore, or an elderly weaver offering a crib beside his spinning wheel. Parishioners were sometimes paid modest sums, bread candles, a few coins to raise these children, though many did it for free, moved by pity faith or the fear of divine judgment. There were no orphanages yet, not in the modern sense. Instead, parishes functioned like patchwork safety nets, part family, part bureaucracy, and part divine intervention. Some children were taken in by the church itself and raised under the watchful eye of monks or nuns. Others were handed off to nearby villagers, usually without ceremony or long-term planning. Surviving rolls from a 14th century English parish show one baby passed through 5 households in 6 months. Each transfer came with a note. Too weak to nurse. Husband refuses. No more bread. You picture that child handed from lap to lap, growing heavier and quieter with each move. Some scholars still dispute how consistently the parish system worked. One school of thought believes the church upheld its duty with diligence, another counters that many children simply slipped through the cracks. Letters from a bishop in Normandy lament, "Too many small souls go unnamed and unmissed, buried before they are known." But amid the sorrow, quirky kindness also peeked through. In Bruges, one priest kept a secret ledger of each child's first laugh. He didn't record baptisms or weights, just laughter and the dates it arrived. One entry reads, "Martin found in winter laughed in spring, like snow becoming brook. If that doesn't warm your chest like a well-stoked hearth, you may need another blanket." The monk stops by the abbey hearth and lowers the child into a basket lined with wool. Another brother jots a note in the ledger, "Infant male left at gate, no name." But tomorrow he might be called Thomas or Jude or left as nameless. It will depend on who comes and what they decide. You step back into the rain. Somewhere beyond the abbey walls, the mother walks away, heart hollow and feet soaked. And behind you, the village turns its gears again, deciding in bits and fragments whether to rescue or forget. The scent of ink and beeswax leads you down a narrow hallway where a door creaks open to reveal the almoner's chamber. Here, everything is accounted for. The church's role in charity wasn't just spiritual, it was administrative. Behind the monk's desk sits a thick ledger, its leather binding cracked, its pages stiff with age and candle smoke. This is where the orphans live on paper. You watch as he dips a quill, scratches a few lines, and blows gently to dry the ink. The entry is simple. One swaddled child brought to hearth, provided bread and wool, will review need for milkmaid. The child's whole existence reduced to 3 lines and a date. Medieval almoners were often the first to make decisions about abandoned children, how they would be fed, who might raise them, whether they were worth the cost. It wasn't cruelty, it was triage. When half the parish was poor and winter loomed, every loaf of bread given away had consequences. The ledgers kept here weren't just financial records, they were quiet lifelines. You scan entries noting donations, 3 eggs from Widow Marjorie, 2 bolts of rough cloth from baker's son. Sometimes the child's behavior was recorded too. Boy climbs abbey wall, admonished, girl steals candle, whipped lightly. It's all there in the almoner's neat crabbed hand. Scholars disagree on how reliable these ledgers are. Some claim they offer rich, detailed windows into daily life. Others warn they reflect only what monks deemed worth writing, leaving gaps where feelings, names, or quiet kindness might have been. A child may have been dearly loved, but only remembered as infant disobedient. History can be a flat mirror if no one polishes it. Still, there are surprises. One entry from a German monastery reads, "Orphan boy asked why bread must be stale, answered, 'Because warm bread is for souls without sin.'" He frowned. You smile imagining the small rebellion of a child, questioning holy bread hierarchy. Beside the ledger, the monk keeps a stack of wooden tokens, half coins fabric, scraps a ring, missing its stone. These were left with the children, and he's labeled each one with string tags. Possibly Judith's mother, unknown returned, once unclaimed. Some are carved with symbols, a feather, a bird, a crude star meant to serve as identifiers in case a parent returned. Few ever did. One shelf holds a separate book, the Book of Returned. It's thin. You run your fingers along its spine and open it to find only 4 names. One entry notes a woman who came back for her child. 5 years later, holding the other half of a broken comb. The monk doubted her claim, but returned the child anyway. She wept like Mary at the tomb he had written in the margin. You glance around the quiet room and realize this is the orphan's story, told not in voices, but in ink flower and scratched parchment. Behind every neat line lies a life in limbo, waiting for milk, for mercy, for someone to decide they mattered. The path from parchment to people winds into the village where decisions about orphans shift from record books to hearths and workbenches. You're led through muddy lanes and thatched doorways into homes that aren't homes, not quite. Here some children become daughters and sons. Others become labor. You watch as a thin boy scrubs a pewter pot in a tanner's cottage, his knuckles red and raw. He's no longer called orphan, he's called apprentice. That's how many children found placement, not through adoption as we know it, but through agreements that offered food and lodging in exchange for labor obedience and time. Fosterage was sometimes the better fate. Families might raise a child as their own, especially if kinship ties existed or spiritual duty was felt. These children might learn a trade, attend rudimentary church lessons, or even inherit land, though that was rare and mostly limited to boys. Apprenticeship, meanwhile, was more transactional. A child might be legally bound to a shoemaker, blacksmith, or cook from as young as 7. In return for 7 to 10 years of service, they received shelter skills and survival. Some records show kindness. A Norwich furrier named Elias wrote in his will that his apprentice orphan shall have my best tunic and his pick of my remaining boots. Others weren't so generous. A 15th century weaver in Ghent was fined for striking his orphan apprentice with a wooden shuttle so hard the boy lost hearing in one ear. No one removed the child from the home. There's no scholarly consensus on which system proved better. Some argue fosterage offered love, apprenticeship offered structure. Others note that both routes could lead to exploitation or indifference. What's clear is that the choice often had less to do with the child's needs and more with the receiving family's situation. And then there were children who didn't quite fit either mold. Those too small to work or too loud to settle might float between placements. One ledger mentions girl age 6, returned by miller's wife cites unquiet spirit. You imagine her maybe stubborn, maybe scared, trying to find a place to belong. The next line reads, sent to herbalist in Moore Cottage. Review in spring. A few ended up in legal limbo. Without parents, they lacked formal guardians. Some monasteries tried to claim ownership. Others wanted nothing to do with them. In Florence City, officials debated whether orphans counted as citizens, which determined their right to be buried inside church walls. The final ruling only baptized orphans with known places of origin. Everyone else buried just outside the gate. Yet quirky stories still peek through. A boy in York, apprenticed to a baker, became known as Tom Crust after sneaking extra bread to a stray dog. His nickname stuck, and when he later opened his own bakery, the sign read, Crust and Sons. No sons existed, it was a joke. But the bread was real. So was his journey from no name to name, from burden to baker. By the time you reach the convent walls, the world quiets. Stone arches curve like folded hands, and the air smells of beeswax rosemary, and something vaguely medicinal. This is where many orphan girls found refuge not as daughters, not as servants, but as sisters. Or at least novitiates in training to become them. You step through a side door into the cloister garden, where young girls in coarse wool habits weed the lavender beds. Their heads are bowed, their mouths silent. Some of them arrived here as toddlers. Others were brought in after bouncing from one failed foster home to another. The convent offered food safety education and structure. In exchange, obedience, silence, and the slow shedding of worldly identity. The life awaiting these girls was equal parts sacred and shadowed. They learned to read psalms before they learned to write their names. They tended the sick-baked altar bread and dyed cloth for ecclesiastical robes. For some, this was a sanctuary. For others, a slow-locked room. Convents didn't always demand vows. Girls might remain until marriage age, or until a relative claimed them, which rarely happened. A few became full nuns, though without dowries their paths were limited. Others served indefinitely in lay roles, helpers without titles, somewhere between servant and sister. One 14th century register from a Bavarian convent lists 5 girls of unknown origin housed in second dormitory. No names, just ages. One entry has a note, refuses embroidery, sings while washing. That last detail lingers like a candle's glow, defiance or joy, it's hard to tell. Historians debate whether this system empowered or erased. Some argue that convent life gave orphan girls rare access to literacy and medicine. Others suggest it stripped them of agency, forcing them into a rhythm, not of their choosing. The truth likely flickers somewhere in between moments of comfort, wrapped in a larger silence. Convent life had its own peculiarities. At one abbey near Avignon, the nuns trained the orphans to keep bees. The practice was part spiritual, part practical. One girl, aged 12, became known for whispering prayers to the hive. She believed bees could carry messages to God. The abbess allowed it. Then there were feast days. Even orphan girls were allowed brief spells of joy, extra bread, a bit of honey, maybe a tale told by an older nun. During Candlemas, the girls processed through the chapel with handmade tapers, each flame a flicker of fragile identity. One account from 1386 notes a child named Anya, who dropped her candles, started to cry, and was comforted not by a nun, but by the abbey cat, which curled in her lap. That cat shows up again and again in convent records, not because it mattered, but because someone kept writing it down. As you leave the cloister, the bells toll for vespers. The girls rise from the garden and form a quiet line. They carry no tokens, no titles, just the memory of lavender and the feel of sun-warmed stones under their feet. The convent stone walls fade behind you as you wander downhill into a smaller parish cottage, the kind where orphans were kept not in cloisters but in common rooms. Inside, a fire sputters low, and the air smells of cabbage and wood smoke. A young boy, perhaps 8, sits on a 3-legged stool beside a pot, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon longer than his arm. This is dinner, and it isn't much. A typical orphan's diet in the Middle Ages could be summed up in one word: pottage. A kind of mush made from whatever grains, roots, or greens were available. It was served with grim consistency. You imagine the boy's mind wandering, hoping for a scrap of bacon, a rind of cheese, an apple that hadn't gone soft. But unless it was a feast day or a mistake, such treats were rare. Church records from 15th century York list daily rations for orphan wards, gruel of barley, small beer, bread crusts, lentils when in season. Occasionally, children were given eggs, though only on saints' days, and meat. Once a month, perhaps. If a wealthy donor passed through, or if the village slaughtered a pig, the children might each receive a slice of fatback. Celebration didn't taste sweet. It tasted salty and hard to chew. One particularly vivid account survives from a Flemish poorhouse where a monk noted, "Child whined for more pottage, was given turnip skin, and told to be grateful." Gratitude, it seems, was part of the menu. There's no firm consensus among scholars about whether these diets were merely meager or truly malnourishing. Some argue the average medieval orphan ate no worse than a poor peasant child. Others highlight higher mortality rates among institutionalized orphans as evidence that their sustenance fell below survival standards. Still, quirks abound. A 14th century convent in Aragon allowed children to pick herbs for flavoring nettle parsley, sometimes mint. One nun kept a tastebook where she recorded the children's reactions. Gosselin enjoyed time. Marietta said, "Sage tickled." It's a rare, tender glimpse into a culinary world with few comforts. The boy in the cottage lifts his spoon and slurps quietly. Across the room, a girl chews on black bread, her feet wrapped in sackcloth for warmth. When the fire dims, they'll huddle on straw mats, bellies half full, but warm enough to sleep. Tomorrow brings the same meal, the same bowl, the same ladle worn, smooth at the handle. But tonight, just tonight, a woman enters with a baked apple. She presses it into the girl's hand and whispers for being still. The fruit is small and bruised, but smells of cinnamon. The girl eats it slowly like it's treasure. You sit in the corner, invisible but close. You can hear the scrape of bowls, the sigh of wind against the shutter, the faint content murmur of a child falling asleep with a warm mouth and sticky fingers. In a world where hunger shaped identity, even a bit of sweetness could taste like safety. Morning breaks with the clang of iron against stone. You find yourself in the courtyard of a parish poorhouse where order is prized almost as highly as salvation. A small group of children shuffle along a chalk line, each clutching a bucket broom or rag. Their faces are set, their eyes wary. This isn't cruelty exactly, but misbehavior doesn't go unnoticed. Discipline here is firm and at times theatrical. Children are taught early that obedience earns warmth and defiance earns the cold. Misstep, and you might be assigned extra chores, a meal skipped, or more ominously, a visit to the punishment bench. It's not elaborate, just a slab of oak polished by decades of frightened fidgeting, situated beneath a tapestry of St. Jerome, who always seems to be watching. You see a boy today, maybe 9, caught sneaking an extra crust of bread. The punishment. Kneeling in the courtyard with pebbles under his knees, hands clasped in mock prayer. Not brutal, but it lingers. Discipline varied across regions. In some parishes, orphans were corrected with stern lectures and extra duties. In others, punishments were harsher light beatings, cold baths, or most humiliating of all, public shaming. One account from a 14th century London priory describes a girl made to wear a tunic dyed yellow and stitched with the word liar for 3 weeks. Another record from Dijon mentions a boy locked overnight in a cellar for disrespecting the baker's wife. His crime, refusing to say grace. Historians remain divided over the intentions behind such punishment. Some argue it was rooted in care, an attempt to provide moral structure for rootless children. Others believe it veered too easily into abuse, especially in underfunded institutions with little oversight. Still, oddities surface. In one French poorhouse, the children were required to perform short morality plays every month, part penance, part entertainment. A particularly rebellious girl named Odette became famous for playing the villain in every script. When asked why, she reportedly said, "The villain gets better lines." Her punishment? None. The abbess let it stand. Punishments weren't always physical. Isolation was used too. Children might be made to sit at mealtime, facing a wall, or scrub chamber pots alone during feast day games. The message was clear: conform or disappear. But even within discipline, compassion occasionally crept through. One Carmelite friar in Genoa noted in his diary, "When the child weeps too long, I allow him figs." That friar's name is lost, but his figs remain sweet and soft in the margins of an otherwise harsh narrative. The boy in the courtyard finishes his kneeling. His legs are stiff, but he rises with dignity, dusting pebbles from his knees. An older girl offers him a bit of cloth for padding next time. He nods but says nothing. Not here. Not where walls remember everything. You step back, the stone under your feet, warming as the sun lifts higher. Order returns to the poorhouse. Buckets are filled, floors scrubbed. Misdeeds forgiven, but never entirely forgotten. By twilight, the mood shifts. Torches flicker in iron sconces, and soft chants echo from a side chapel where a carved statue of St. Nicholas watches over rows of wooden benches. You settle onto one's shoulders, aching from invisible centuries. Tonight, even orphans get stories, and St. Nicholas, patron of children and the lost, takes center stage. The tale begins with a famine. A cruel winter left villagers starving, and a desperate butcher lured 3 young boys into his cellar. He killed them, salted their flesh, and planned to sell the meat. But St. Nicholas, visiting the village in disguise, saw through the ruse. He stormed the cellar, raised the boys from their barrels, and restored them, whole, blinking, and forever changed. It's a chilling tale, and yet somehow comforting. The idea that someone might come for you, even at your most forgotten, gripped the medieval imagination tightly. Orphans especially clung to Nicholas. He wasn't just a saint, he was a celestial advocate, the only grown-up who always showed up. Nicholas's feast day on December 6th was marked with small gifts, nuts, apples, carved dolls. In many poor houses and abbeys, children placed shoes or bowls by their beds, hoping for something sweet by morning. Some got barley candy or gingerbread, others got nothing, but the hope remained. One orphan in a 15th century convent wrote, "If Nicholas forgets me, I will pretend he is busy with kings." Scholars debate the evolution of the Nicholas myth. Was he originally a Greek bishop known for dowries and sea miracles, or did the child-saving legend grow later shaped by monastic storytelling? The truth blurs. But the impact was real. In some regions, Nicholas was invoked during every cradle blessing. In others, his icon stood by the entrance to children's dormitories. At one abbey, the monks performed puppet plays of Nicholas rescuing children from danger fires, floods, false families. The figures were crude, the stories dramatic, but the message clear: someone sees you, someone remembers. One peculiar account survives from a Scottish priory, where a group of orphans carved tiny wooden shoes and left them beneath the statue. Days later, they found them filled with roasted chestnuts. The monks denied any involvement. The children declared it a miracle. Whether it was kindness or careful planning hardly mattered. That moment stayed with them. You glance up at the painted image of Nicholas, now eyes kind, robe crimson, holding 3 golden balls in one hand and a crooked staff in the other. He looks nothing like the jolly figure that would come centuries later. He looks like someone who has seen too much and still chooses to help. The orphans kneel before him, whispering prayers only half formed. One girl asks for warmer shoes. A boy asks for his sister, taken last spring, to another parish. A toddler just hums too young to know who Nicholas is, but sensing this is where wishes go. Outside, the bells toll for Compline. Inside, hope flickers like a votive flame, small, steady, and stubborn. Morning brings a small procession. 3 monks and a midwife, cloaks rustling, feet damp with dew. In the crook of the midwife's arm rests a bundled infant no more than a few days old. As they approach the abbey, she gently unties the cloth at the baby's chest. Inside, pinned with a wooden skewer, is a scrap of wool stitched with a single letter, E. No name, no explanation, just the token. You trail them into the scriptorium, where such relics are recorded with care. Here, tokens serve as both proof and poetry. They are the orphan's only inheritance: a string, a shell, a button, or a swatch of patterned fabric. Sometimes they are pieces cut from the mother's own gown, torn in half, so the other side might someday return. Most never do. These identifiers were essential. With so many children left at abbeys or parish gates, tokens became the only link between child and origin. In places like 15th century Florence or Lisbon, orphan registries listed each token in minute detail: cloth red and gold, check burned at edge, copper coin filed to semicircle, string of 2 blue beads, one cracked. These scraps were stored in bundles, each matched to a child's name, or placeholder name, on the ledger. Some scholars argue these tokens weren't just for practical reunification. They served as emotional bookmarks, physical reminders that the child was loved once, even if briefly. Others question their reliability, noting that matching tokens after years of fading memory and moldy storage often led to tragic confusion. One record from Rouen tells of a woman returning for her daughter, presenting a strip of linen embroidered with a rose. But the ledger listed 3 rose tokens. The abbess had to choose. We gave her the quiet one the entry reads in, hope it would matter less. Occasionally the tokens told entire stories. A child left with a wooden flute, another with a coin punch to spell Ave. One girl arrived with a small mirror. Her mother had broken it in half, keeping one side for herself. It said the girl carried her half into adulthood, polishing it with breadcrumbs until the day it cracked. At one Venetian orphan hospital, tokens were not only stored, they were displayed hung from cords, like a quiet gallery of longing. Visitors were not allowed to speak as they viewed them. Just look, remember. Today the child with the E-scrap is carried to the nursery where others like him sleep in rows of carved wooden cradles. A nun pins the token to his blanket, then pauses. She hums a lullaby, one half remembered from her own childhood. He stirs briefly, then settles again. You watch from the shadows, wondering what the E stands for. Emilia, Elmo, eternity. The mystery will sleep beside him, stitched into wool and history alike. Above his cradle, a small shelf holds dozens more tokens, quiet echoes of mothers who had no choice but left anything behind. You follow the nun through a narrow passageway, dimly lit and scented with candle wax and old rushes. At the end lies a ledger room with a different kind of sorrow. Here notes are brief, precise, and heavy. Siblings separated, no recourse. Twins sent to different houses. Boy remained. Sister collected by miller's wife. These lines were common and always final. Separation wasn't a punishment, it was a consequence of practicality. Few families or institutions could care for more than one orphaned child. When siblings arrived together, they were often divided by age, gender, or availability of care. A convent might take the girl, while the boy was sent to a farm 2 towns away. Sometimes they were placed only miles apart. Other times, oceans intervened. One 14th century record from Antwerp notes 2 brothers separated during plague season. The elder, age 9, was sent to Bruges as an apprentice. The younger 5 remained in the hospital ward. A year later, a notation appears, elder inquires for sibling, told he was too small to remember. Scholars remain conflicted about whether administrators fully understood the emotional toll. Some argue they acted out of necessity, choosing survival over sentiment. Others suggest they underestimated or ignored the bonds between siblings. The evidence lies buried in marginalia, quiet scribbles beside names notes like girl cried 3 days after brother taken or boy asked nightly for sister's return. Occasionally attempts were made to preserve connection. A convent in Normandy wrote letters between separated siblings, though many went undelivered. In England, one abbey allowed children to exchange small tokens, a knotted string, a carved button, or a cloth square marked with ash. These were meant to be worn as signs in hopes of future reunion. The effectiveness of these rituals is still debated, but their existence suggests someone, perhaps just a single nun, tried. Then there are the rare, almost miraculous stories. In Venice, 2 sisters separated at age 4, and 6 met again 20 years later, both working in textile stalls beside the same canal. They recognized one another by a shared birthmark and a nursery rhyme neither had forgotten. The record simply reads, "Sisters, rejoined, wept in market." Such stories are few. More often, siblings remained memories' names without faces. In one sad case from Prague, a boy inscribed his sister's name into the underside of a bread trough. Decades later, it was found during a renovation. No other record of her exists. You walk past the rows of shelves where such ledgers sleep bound in twine, brittle with time. The room feels stiller than any chapel. There are no icons here, no candles, no whispered prayers. Only names divided lives forked apart like branches snapped in wind. Outside, a bell rings for evening prayer. You wonder if 2 children now grown might pass each other on the road tonight without knowing they once shared a lullaby. And if in some quiet corner of their memory, the same melody still hums. The streets outside the abbey are loud with market clatter and the clink of pewter cups. But in the narrow alleys behind the fishmonger's stalls, another world unfurls. Here, orphans who slip through the cracks of the church system, live by their own code scraps for supper, rags for warmth and silence when it matters most. You spot a boy crouched beside a cartwheel, one eye on the cabbage leaves tumbling from a vendor's sack. He times it perfectly, a shout, a clang, and he lunges, grabs 2 leaves, maybe a bit of turnip, and disappears. This is the life of the unclaimed. Some left the poorhouses by choice. Others were never entered into any ledger at all. Street life was neither romantic nor rare. In medieval cities, abandoned children often formed loose groups begging at church doors or sleeping in barns. Some called themselves the kinless, others simply nobodies. They learned quickly whom to trust, where the dogs barked less, and which baker tossed out crusts at dusk. By the 13th century, major cities like Paris and London had enough street children to draw attention from civic leaders, but responses varied. In some places, efforts were made to corral or teach them. In others, they were rounded up as vagrants punished for existing outside structure. One Paris record calls them phantoms, in daylight neither citizens nor criminals, yet treated as both. Scholars still argue whether street orphans were failed by the system or cleverly evaded it. Some suggest these children saw the rigidity of abbey life and fled. Others insist they were simply forgotten during plagues wars or harvest failures. Either way, their lives were marked by improvisation. And yet, even here, humanity clung on. One boy in Bruges fashioned shoes out of dried fish skin, becoming locally known as eelfoot. Another taught himself to mimic bird calls and used the skill to distract guards while others stole food. He reportedly had a soft spot for cats and shared half his hauls with a ginger Tom that followed him for years. There's a story from Naples of a girl who slept beneath the arch of a ruined aqueduct, claiming she could read dreams in the frost on stone. Locals paid her in bread for predictions. Whether her gift was real or performance didn't matter. She survived. That was the point. Not all made it. Winters were cruel. Injuries went untreated. Rival gangs of child thieves sometimes fought for territory. But even in the shadows, there was structure, rules, bonds. One 15th century Venetian orphan describes street life as a crooked family, where no one speaks unless they have bread or bruises to offer. You pause as the sun sets behind the chimneys. Smoke curls like ribbon above rooftops. Somewhere down the alley, a girl sings a half-remembered lullaby, her voice thin but steady. It echoes off stone, joining the sounds of hooves, bells, and soup boiling behind shutters. No cradle, no token, no ledger. But still a life-hardened hidden humming in the cracks. Later, as moonlight spills across the stone courtyard, a softer rhythm takes over. From within the abbey nursery, a whisper of music floats thin, high, and strange. You move closer and discover a cluster of children curled around a novice with a small wooden harp. Her fingers pluck gently as the children hum, sway, and occasionally drift into sleep. These are the songs orphans sang, not nursery rhymes exactly, but lullabies shaped by grief, hunger, and scraps of hope. Medieval orphan songs were rarely written down. They passed from mouth to mouth, changing slightly with every telling. Some were prayers disguised as melodies. Others were tales disguised as comfort. One haunting French fragment goes, "Mama's hands were bread. Now I hold my own." Another from a convent record in Austria, "Saint Mary tuck me in. Saint John shut the door. If the wolves come close, don't let them roar." Scholars only recently began tracing these melodies, often found scribbled in margins beside sermon notes or hidden in ledgers under names. Few survive in full, but even fragments tell stories. A Latin refrain found in a Spanish orphanage translates to "sleep while the candles burn low. They'll forget your name if you snore too loud." Tender, strange, and a little bit heartbreaking. Some songs were invented by the children themselves. In one 15th century Yorkshire home, a nun recorded lyrics made up by the older girls meant to calm the younger ones. One verse reads, "Close your eyes and count the sheep, not the years you couldn't keep." The rhyme is clumsy, but the intent is pure. Orphan lullabies were often sung in pairs, one child singing to another, mimicking the parent they didn't remember. A boy barely 8 might rock a younger child, murmuring a tune he half invented. These moments weren't assigned or organized. They simply happened. Comfort makes its own rules. At times, the songs turned eerie. In Hungary, a common orphan refrain was about the mother beneath the earth, a mythical figure who would rise from the soil and cradle those forgotten by real mothers. The lyrics promised warmth underground bred from roots and lullabies hummed by worms. It sounds grim, but the children sang it like a promise, not a threat. There's no consensus on whether these songs healed or merely distracted. Some historians believe they allowed emotional processing through repetition and rhythm. Others argue the melodies only soften the surface of deep, unspoken sadness. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps that's why they linger in record books written between flower orders and burial lists. One nun in Florence preserved a set of tunes on vellum and titled them simply "Songs We Needed." No names, no attribution. Just 6 melodies inked beside drawings of children holding hands. Tonight, the harp song finishes. The children are half asleep, breathing in slow waves. The novice sets down the harp and gently extinguishes a candle with her fingers. No one claps. There's no applause in lullaby land. Only the creak of beds, the soft exhale of forgotten lyrics and dreams padded in borrowed sound. In the quiet hours before dawn, you wander through the churchyard, dew clinging to your boots, the stars fading into a lavender sky. Behind the chapel, there's a small stone shed once used for storing tools, now converted into a records room, sparse, chill, and filled with old scrolls tied in twine. This is where you find a list titled Unnamed. It holds dozens of entries, just ages, hair color, distinguishing marks. No family, no lineage. Just boy brown eyes, thumb missing, or girl soft voice limp in left leg. Without parents to name them, or documents to place them in family trees, orphans in the Middle Ages often grew up nameless, not literally, but socially. They were assigned Christian names at baptism, but surnames were usually omitted or replaced with markers like "of the parish the small" or "from nowhere." Some bore the label "no one's" written directly into the margins of ledgers. You step further into the room and read more Jacob possibly born near the western fields. Agnes called that "by nurse no record." These weren't mysteries to be solved. They were identities that never formed. And in a society that prized lineage titles and bloodlines, not having a family meant you floated visible yet unrooted. Some children were given surnames based on their condition. A boy with a limp might be Crippleman. A girl with red hair might be Ginger. Others were tagged with trade Smithkin for a blacksmith's apprentice or Cooklet for a kitchen ward. These stuck not out of affection, but convenience. Historians debate whether these placeholder names helped or hindered. Did they offer stability, or did they mark children forever as second class? Then there were orphans who chose their own names. One lad in a German town simply declared himself Peter of the Moon. He carved it into a beam above his bed and refused to answer to anything else. The monks allowed it. Perhaps they understood that claiming a name was an act of quiet rebellion. Not all name stories were joyful. One nun's diary recalls a boy who answered to that one. No one remembered how it started, only that no one ever corrected it. When he died of fever at 12, the Abbey ledger listed him as that one. died with rosary in hand. Yet, amid the anonymity, there were glimmers of identity-making. Some orphans became known for small habits one girl always hummed while she swept, so they called her Breezy. A boy who never smiled was known simply as Stone. Sometimes these labels hardened into legacy. You find a page noting that Stone later became a stonecutter. No family crest, no inheritance, just a chisel and the name he earned with it. As the sky lightens to pale gold, you step outside and imagine the hundreds of children who once slept nearby, unknown to history, but deeply real. The world may have forgotten their names, but the wind still moves through the churchyard as if whispering them anyway. The village bakery opens with a soft thud of shutters and the sigh of flour dust escaping into morning light. You drift toward the warmth drawn not just by the scent of rising dough, but by the quiet bustle within. Behind the counter stands a man in a soot-streaked apron, shaping loaves with practiced hands. His name is Elias, not by birth, but by choice. He's a former orphan, and one of the rare few whose journey through the medieval system ends not in anonymity, but in ownership. Many orphans who survived childhood faced a new hurdle at adolescence adulthood without anchor. They entered the world with no inheritance, no family ties, and little protection. Some, like Elias, became tradesmen. Others wandered as hired hand soldiers or farm laborers. And a significant number vanished entirely from records absorbed into the lower ranks of society, unremarked but indispensable. Guilds were one of the few paths forward. If an orphan had apprenticed successfully, they might be accepted, though not without resistance. Guilds valued legacy, and without a family name or master's recommendation, entry was rare. One former orphan in Lubeck was denied membership twice before carving a niche as an independent broom seller. His business card, such as it was, read only Johann Reliable with twigs. Scholars debate whether orphaned adults fared much worse than other peasants. Some argue their lack of kin left them vulnerable to exploitation. Others believe the skills they learned in poorhouses and abbeys, cooking, sewing, cleaning, made them more adaptable. Surviving letters from the era include references to orphans as practical, grateful, and silent when required. It's a grim badge, but one that occasionally opened doors. Quirky exceptions flicker through history. A former orphan named Helda became the favored midwife of a Danish countess. A boy once listed as nameless infant choleric grew up to pen minor religious poetry. 6 verses still survive in a church in Utrecht. And in one particularly odd case, an orphan-turned-abbey gardener introduced onions to a monastery that previously believed them sinful. His name, Brother Leo, patron of reluctant vegetables. Elias the baker is among the quiet success stories. He employs 2 boys now, both orphans, both prone to mischief and over-salting the rolls. He pretends to scold them, but always sends them home with the day's broken loaves. On Thursdays, he places a small basket of ginger biscuits near the window, labeled for those with empty pockets. No one needs to explain. No one ever does. You linger at the door as he hums a tune, something soft, almost like a lullaby. One of the boys joins in, off-key but content. The oven glows orange, and the bread rises like quiet victory. No lineage carved above the hearth, no family crest. Just flower fire and 2 hands that remember being small, cold, and hungry. Sometimes survival is the legacy, and sometimes that's more than enough. The path winds gently uphill toward the cemetery. Nothing grand, just a scattering of moss-covered stones and wooden markers. You walk slowly now. The village behind you quiets, and only the wind and the caw of a lone crow keep you company. Here lie the forgotten and the remembered side by side beneath a patchwork of grass and lichen. Some graves bear names, others only symbols or initials, and many, none at all. Burial for medieval orphans was a question of space, money, and mercy. If the child had been baptized, they might be buried in consecrated ground, though not always in the main churchyard. Often they rested at the margins literally. The outermost ring of the cemetery became a silent gathering place for the kinless. You stop at a wooden cross leaning slightly to the left. No inscription. A weather-worn strip of cloth still clings to its base, knotted with a small brass button. Perhaps a token. Perhaps all that remained. The grave is small. You imagine the child buried here was no more than 5. Convents and abbeys tried to commemorate in their own ways. Some marked the deaths with soft tolls of the bell, others with brief notes in the back of the ledger. Infant cold at waking, girl stopped breathing at compline. The words are sparse, no laments, no eulogies. But between the lines, a kind of reverence. One monastery in Umbria kept a book of little souls where names were written beside hand-drawn stars. Most stars were plain, a few had golden ink. One record explains a golden star for those who sang, smiled, or shared. The abbess believed joy deserved to be remembered. Historians still puzzle over how these small losses rippled outward. Did their absence reshape the community? Did the orphans who lived carry their memory forward? The evidence is elusive. Some former orphans kept tokens from lost friends, a piece of ribbon, a scratched stone, a lullaby only half sung. One elderly nun wrote, "We remember them in the baking, each bread we need, a name we hum." And so mourning happened not in grand processions, but in repetition. A cradle reused, a name whispered to a new arrival, a candle lit on a stormy night, not because it marked a death, but because it marked that someone had once lived. In one record from Bohemia, an orphan-turned scribe added a final note to the abbey scroll. They were small and we were busy. Still they smiled. That may be the gentlest epitaph in all of history. You take one last look at the graveyard before stepping back down the path. The wind carries the smell of damp earth and fading lavender. Somewhere far below, a bell tolls not for death, but for vespers. Another day ending, another night beginning. Loss here is quiet. It doesn't shout or shake. It lingers like a lullaby you almost remember. A hum in the bones, a warmth in the chest. It shaped them all to found the lost, and those caught somewhere in between. Now the path grows dim. The graves fade into shadows, and the abbey's light flickers like a candle behind fog glass. You've walked alongside those who had no names, no homes, no lineage, only scraps of cloth and songs barely sung. Yet somehow they lived. They learned to laugh, to knead bread, to hum under their breath. Even when history forgot them, they left threads behind woven into ledgers, lullabies, and the softened corners of old stone. Let the story quiet now. Breathe in slowly. Picture the convent garden at dusk, where lavender sways in the breeze and bees hum themselves to sleep. Picture the warm bowl of pottage, the shared crust, the faint harp from down the corridor. The world they knew wasn't kind, but it held corners of comfort, folded into the folds of habit sleeves and whispered by saints with crooked staffs. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?